I should probably tell you something now, just to get it out of the way. I hate jazz. You okay?
It doesn't matter whether you align more with Emma Stone or Ryan Gosling. Chances are you have listened to a musician that was influenced either directly or indirectly by jazz. And if we want to narrow our scope specifically to guitarists, there's arguably none more influential than Wes Montgomery. Wes defied conventions at every turn. He didn't learn how to play six-string guitar until he was 20 years old, and he adopted a picking technique that drew fans and baffled critics. But what if I told you Wes's defining characteristics, the techniques that made him so popular, came about by accident? Unlike most jazz musicians of his time, Wes was not proficient at reading music. He built his skill by listening to Charlie Christian solos and picking them up by ear. Christian undoubtedly influenced Wes musically, but it was his indifference toward genre conventions that would rub off on the young guitarist and separate him from the crowd. When Christian started playing with big bands in the late 30s, the guitar had a pretty defined role. They were buried in the rhythm section and rarely seen or heard, which was mostly due to the lack of amplification on the instrument. However, Charlie Christian refused to accept this conventional role and rigged his guitar up to an amp in order to be heard over the horns and piano. His electric guitar solos for the Benny Goodman Orchestra were some of the first ever recorded, and his influence would include more names than just Wes Montgomery. But his inventive nature and refusal to accept unwritten rules in the jazz world would have a profound impact on how Wes would develop as a musician. Christian died at age 25 just as big bands were getting, well, less big, and the scene gave way to bebop, which valued virtuosity and breakneck speed over listenability. Guitarists coming of age in the bop era faced similar challenges to those in big bands. Bebop ensembles usually consisted of upright bass, maybe piano, and one or two horn players, but in most cases there was no place for guitar. Swing guitar sounded like this. Its tone was choppy and bright, not exactly the sound that players like Coltrane and Miles Davis were looking for when searching for accompaniment. So the only logical step for an aspiring jazz guitarist was to follow in the footsteps of Charlie Christian and become a lead player. However, Christian played at a time when the tempo of the music was slow enough to tap your foot to, but in the new up-tempo bebop movement, many guitarists didn't have the chops to make the transition. Wes was one of the few guitarists who could keep up with the breakneck speed, all while adopting his own unique style. In fact, it seemed like Wes's signature techniques were almost counterintuitive.
Yeah, I should do the opposite. I should.
If every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right.
Yes. I will do the opposite.
Rather than play the guitar with a pick to increase the speed of single-note lines, Wes used the side of his thumb to strum chords and pluck notes. It gave his tone a round, thick quality that sounded unlike Charlie Christian, or really any musician before him. Even though it would seem like it would slow his lines down, it did not in the least bit. His thumb alone was faster than most other guitarists who use fingerstyle or a pick. This immediately recognizable tone was emulated by countless others who tried to enter the bop scene thereafter, but none were able to pull off the tricks that Wes was able to do with just their thumb. Montgomery also incorporated octave melodies into his solos, which was unheard of at the time. Octaves are notes that we hear as being the same, even though they are different pitches. Wes would run up and down the neck with these octaves in places where his peers would play only single-note lines. Again, he took a risk that could have potentially slowed down his solos for the sake of an innovative tone, but he was still able to keep up with the best of the bebop scene.
But this technique, which is unschooled and it's pure Wes Montgomery, this technique and what you do with it, playing octaves in your solo lines, this is what set has set you apart from every other guitarist in life.
But Wes Montgomery didn't set out to change the landscape of jazz when he adopted these strange new techniques. This octave technique came about from his guitar not staying in tune, and him needing to play octaves to make sure the notes in his solos were the notes he was intending to play. Here's the story behind why he uses his thumb.
Do notes. So I said, well, I'll break that habit, so I just use an amplifier all the time. But while doing that, I would go into the night practicing, and but I forgot I was disturbing neighbors.
Yeah.
So that was very shortly brought to my attention. And so then I thought, well, I have to cut down some kind of way. But I had my amplifier really cut down. If I cut down much more, I might as well not use it. So then I set the pick on the top of the amplifier and made it much of a rounder sound, softer. So I said, well, I'll use that until I get where I can play, and then I'll use a pick.
Sure, we can just dismiss this as Wes being humble on TV. I'm sure there was more thought behind his permanent switch to the thumb. But it still remains that this technique, what set him apart from any guitarist before him and what musicians will remember him by in the decades following his death, came about by chance. He didn't play this way for the sake of novelty or publicity. His style came about by pure necessity. And his background, him playing cheap guitars practicing in dense apartments, what made him the musician he is today, was personified in the sounds that came from his recordings. When we listen to a Wes Montgomery solo, we hear more than just arpeggios and block chords. We hear the obstacles that Wes had to overcome in order to play the solo at all. He set the precedent for what a guitar was supposed to sound like in a jazz setting by forming a tone that came from his experiences rather than emulating the few jazz guitarists that came before him. This progressive, individualistic mentality towards the instrument set the stage for none other than Jimi Hendrix. Jimi was known to have had Wes Montgomery's records in his collection, and his reverence for the jazz legend was showcased in his song Villanova Junction. Now here's Bumpin' on Sunset by Wes Montgomery. The musical similarities are certainly there, but just like Charlie Christian's imprint on Wes, the influence went far deeper than musicality. Jimi learned from Wes to prioritize individuality over genre conventions. Just as Wes Montgomery's tone was an amalgamation of his experiences, Jimi's soloing was an extension of himself. When Jimi let loose, everyone in the audience could feel his soul pouring out, his experiences being conveyed through the 6 strings of the guitar. His solos weren't defined by the notes he played, they stick in our minds because of the way he played them. He didn't care that his guitar was strung upside down or that his solos didn't stick to the traditional blues pentatonic scale, which was most commonly used in rock at the time. What made Jimi Hendrix and Wes Montgomery so great was their irreverence for conventionality and their willingness to push the boundaries of what was considered normal, whether or not that push was even intentional.
There is a story of the bumblebee that has frequently been attached to Wes Montgomery. That according to the laws of aerodynamics, of wing surface to body weight, that it's aerodynamically impossible for the bumblebee to fly. But the bee, not knowing this, flies. Wes Montgomery is
Flying, right?
is flying.
Hey everybody, thank you for watching. I know I'm a relatively new channel, so if you have any ideas for me to improve on, anything you want to see in the future, make sure to leave a comment below and to subscribe to see these future changes in action.